Hello and welcome to part 36 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video we'll be adding a texture to our Minecraft character. Now in the last two videos in this series we made a Minecraft character out of 6 simple blocks. We added an armature to it, we attached the mesh of the character, the blocks, to that armature, and in the last video in part 35 we used a mode called weight paint mode to properly attach the mesh. In other words, we specified which vertices in the mesh were attached to which bones in order to allow us to pose the character and animate the character properly without shearing the character or distorting it at all. In this video, of course, we're going to be adding a texture. Before we do that, we have to unwrap our character mesh. Now, right now, our rig is posed. Our bones have been rotated, maybe even scaled, maybe even moved. I want to clear all that out. So what I'll do is I'll select one of my bones in pose mode, and I'll press A a few times to select all of them, and I'll press Alt R to clear any rotation, and just in case we'll press Alt G and Alt S. I don't need to see my bones right now, so actually I'm going to hide them by going back into their object mode, and then I'll press M to move them to a different layer. The M key brings up your move to layer window, and then you can click one of these separate little squares to move it to a different layer. And if you're not familiar with what layers are, they work basically the same as layers in any graphics program like Gimp or Photoshop. In Blender, they're basically parallel universes, as I kind of jokingly call them. They occupy the same space, but they're down here on your header. You can click to show either one. And of course, you can press Shift and click on multiple to show multiple at the same time. I only want to see my mesh though, because we're just going to be working with that. So I'll just go to that layer. Now the first thing we have to do when we're unwrapping and texturing a object is to mark seams on that mesh. In this case, I'm going to select the mesh and press Tab to go into edit mode. And it's here where I want to go into edge select mode and start selecting edges that I want to be seams. Now if you've never UV wrapped or unwrapped or textured a character using UV mapping, I made a video on this earlier in this video series in which I unwrapped and textured a cube with colors and numbers on each side of the cube. If you have not seen that video, I highly recommend it. I'll put a link to that video on the screen right now. Again, I highly recommend it. I'm going to be going quicker in this video than I did in that video. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. The most important feature on this character is his face. That's how you know that it's a person except for his overall shape. So when I unwrap or mark seams on the head, I kind of want to know which one this is and which direction it should be going. So what I've decided to do is select the edges. I'll go back to my move gizmo that run away from his face. So I'll select all 4 of those edges by right clicking, of course, and holding my shift key down, so that we know that there's going to be 4 faces running away from his face. Let's go ahead and mark the sides of the back of his head and then the bottom back of his head. So all those edges. Again, I have basically 2 U's on each side of his head pointing towards, or the opening pointing towards the front of his face, and then 1 edge selected at the bottom back of his head. To mark a seam, you have to have edges selected, and then you press Control E on your keyboard to bring up your edges menu, and you're going to select Mark Seam. There we go. Don't confuse that with Mark Sharp. That's something entirely different. It won't work. Mark Seam is the one that you want. When you mark a seam, that edge becomes highlighted in red. So when you deselect it, it'll actually look like it's red and not orange. Let's move on to the arms and legs and body. Now when I unwrap the arms, I want to leave all the sides of the arms attached, basically in one big long rectangle with each side kind of being next to each other. So all I want to do is mark 1 back edge top to bottom. Again, I can hold Alt and right click on that to select the entire thing at once. I also need to mark the edges around the top and bottom, so I'll keep holding Shift on my keyboard and I'll mark all 4 of those edges and all 4 of these ones. And again, to mark them, Control E, Mark Seam, not Mark Sharp. Let's go into the exact same thing on the other arm. So I'll select all 4 top and bottom edges. Whoops, don't want that one. And I'll do the same inner back one as well. Okay, so Control E, Mark Seam. Next we'll do the body. The most important face on the body is of course the front of his body. So I'll leave that one the same as the head. I'll have the faces splitting away from that one when we lay it out. So I'll select all the edges running away from that face. And then I'll mark the same sides of the back. And in this case, we'll mark the top of the back as well. So again, I have a U selected on each side, pointing towards, or the opening pointing towards the front of his body. And then I have the edge at the top of the back of his neck selected as well. So Control E, mark seam. Same thing goes for the legs as we did with the arms. So I'll select just one inside back edge, running top to bottom with the Alt key. I'll hold Shift now and get the tops of the legs as well. I'll press Z on my keyboard to go into wireframe mode so I can make sure I'm doing everything right. And I gotta get this one as well. Same thing with the bottom. Get all 4 bottom edges on each leg because they need to be separate as well. Alright, there we go. Control E, mark seam. I think we have all of our seams marked. I'll just press A and take a look around to make sure I didn't forget anything. Looks pretty good to me. It's at this point that you're going to want to save because this is going to be set in stone from this point forward. So I'll press Control S on my keyboard and click. Now the DPI on my screen is set quite low, which means everything is quite big, so you can hopefully see it pretty well. So I'm going to hide my tool shelf. It's kind of taking up too much space on my screen because we want to split this large 3D viewport into 2. If you've seen my UV mapping video on making a textured cube, you know that we have to open up now a separate window that is the UV image editor window. To split this big 3D viewport into 2, I'm going to grab this little cross-hatched area and drag it directly to the left. So that's going to split this window into 2. By the way, if you made a mistake and accidentally grabbed it and moved down, of course you can get this little area, click and drag it back up to merge 2 windows as well. So if you're not familiar with windows at this point, just a little bit of playing, divide your windows up and get used to dividing them or joining them back together like that. I'm going to change this second window into a UV image editor window. Of course, to do that, you click on the change window button on your header and select the UV image editor window right there. The UV image editor window is a window that you can open external images in, and you can also unwrap and lay out faces on an object that you're mapping into this area as well. So what I'll do is, still in edit mode with my character, I'm going to switch into face select mode. And if you're not sure how to scroll this area, basically I'm orbiting. I'm holding down my mouse wheel and dragging. That's how you can pan basically. So in face select mode, I'll press A a few times to select all the faces of my mesh, and then I'll press U and click on unwrap. The U key, when you're in edit mode, brings up your UV mapping menu, and you can click on unwrap. Now that I've done that, it basically takes all my faces and it puts them over here in a nice laid out fashion. If I didn't make any mistakes, nothing will be overlapped. If you forgot any edges, you might have some funny triangles. That means that you didn't unwrap or mark enough seams, but it looks like I did. So it looks like we're doing pretty well. It looks like I have my 2 leg pieces here and my 2 arm pieces right here, but I'm not entirely sure. I know my legs are a little bit longer than my arms. In fact, what I should probably do is I'm going to go back into object mode with my tab key, and I'm going to go back over to my object menu, and I'm going to click on apply scale, and that's going to make sure that everything is stretched correctly in terms of when I unwrap it. That's quite important to do. It took me a long time to learn that actually. So I'll press tab and I'll re-unwrap, so I'll click on U, unwrap, and nothing changed, so I'm fine. Let's go ahead and start selecting islands in this window. So I'll press A to deselect all. I still have everything selected over here. I'm going to put my mouse over one of these sections and press L. That will let me select that island. That might work better, by the way, if you are in face select mode. This is vertice select mode and edge select mode and face select mode and island select mode. I could even use that one. That way I can select islands as they stand without having to press any special keys. Let's grab this one, and I'm just going to move it off to the side because I want to see which one belongs with this, which is the other one like this. So I'll press or right click on this one and grab it, and that looks to be the same size. I think if I grab this one, it would be taller. That means that this one that I have selected right now is a leg and this one is an arm. Let's grab this one and match it up. Now I want to overlap these actually, because when I paint an arm, I want to paint two arms at the same time. So if I overlap these two, they'll be exactly the same. They'll have the exact same texture. To overlap them exactly the same, I want to turn on snapping. And I made a video on snapping a while ago, but I didn't cover it or how to use it in this UV image editor window. It works exactly the same. I click on this little magnet button down here, and I want to turn on snapping not by increment, not by this grid, but I want to snap vertices to vertices. So I'll click on vertex select mode or snap mode. And now if I press G, I can snap and it'll kind of find its way by snapping different vertices to different vertices. And I want to make it like that. So I'll click, and now I know they overlap exactly. I'm going to select that island, still with snapping turned on, and I'll grab that one and snap it up to this one. Great. Now, eventually these sections have to be inside the square, but I'm leaving them out here so that, you know, I can organize this section better as it stands. Let's go ahead and I'm going to select faces at this point. I'm going to select these faces. I want to see kind of what they are. Now, if you watched my last video on UV mapping and using this window, you'll know that there's two separate modes for sort of working with this area versus this area. And they're basically different sync modes. This button switches between, I'm going to see what the description says, keep UV and edit mode mesh selection in sync. Basically what this does is right now as it stands, you can select islands over here and you have to have everything over here selected to see anything in here. But if you click this button to make it dark, you can then just select faces on either side to see what they are. If you didn't have this dark, you couldn't really do that. It would be harder because you have to have everything in this window selected. So there's different benefits, pros and cons to each one of these different modes. In this case, I want to see what these faces are. So that face right there is the top of his arm. Looks like these two are the tops of his arms. So I'm going to overlap them. I'll press G, move that one over. I've still got snapping turned on so it didn't quite behave. Maybe I'll turn it off. Move that one up there and turn snapping back on. And G and snap that one over. I'll grab this one, turn snapping off. Move it over. Grab this one, turn snapping back on. And I'll move it to overlap perfectly. These ones are probably the bottoms of the feet, so I'm going to overlap those as well. And these ones are probably the top of the legs. There we go. I'll turn off snapping. Now we have basically two faces for every face for these faces and these two squares over here. So I'm going to start box selecting. I'll press B to box select, and I want to move these ones over. Those are the bottom of his feet. And then these two would be the tops of his legs. I gotta remember that. I actually might reverse those or put them in a different sort of configuration so that his feet are kind of below his tops of his legs, and then that would be the tops and these would be the bottoms. So I'm going to move these ones below. So the arms will be first over here, and then the legs will be second. That makes sense to me. The legs are also a little bit narrower, as you can see. They're a smaller square. All right, let's go ahead and move the different sections around just to make them fit a little bit better. So I'm going to go back to my other mode, my other sync mode, and reselect everything over here since we know what everything is now. I'm going to select in island select mode. The other kind of sync mode doesn't have that. I'll select this entire island, move it over with my G key. And if you're familiar how to work in this window, everything should work exactly the same in terms of your hotkeys, in terms of your G to grab, R to rotate, S to scale. You can press A to deselect or select all. You can press B to box select. I think anything else that works in here should work in here. Of course, you're working in a 2D environment over here and 3D over here. I don't want anything to be touching the edge of this square. It'll make things a little bit harder for me. So I'm going to move everything just sort of into the middle a little bit. Let's box select the legs, move them over here. Box select the arms, move them over here. Now, I'm not using this space very efficiently. In other words, I have a lot of area in this square, lots of real estate that are pixels on my image that I'm not using. So what I want to do is actually select everything. I'll press the A key a few times. I'm going to scale everything a little bit up. So I'll tap S, and I'm going to just kind of guess to see that maybe that will work fine for me, maybe not. So I'm going to move everything over so that this one kind of fits nicely into one corner. I'll select this island. Oops, I pressed H to hide by accident. So I'll press Control Z to undo. Alright, that one's pretty good. Let's box select these and drag them down. Hopefully they'll fit. Looks like they won't quite, so I will have to scale things down a little bit. I want everything to fit, of course, inside of this square because that'll be my image size. And I'll press A and A and scale everything down just a little bit. And G and Y to move things up and down. And again, in this window, it's kind of like one of those Cartesian planes you learned about in probably grade 6 or grade 5 math. Side to side is the x-axis and up and down is the y-axis. So if you press G and X, you can move things side to side, or G and then Y up and down or top to bottom. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to do a quick save at this point. Control S and click. Now it's at this point that I want to save this UV layout to an image file so I can paint with it in my separate graphics program, in my case Photoshop. I will be talking about other graphics programs in this video as well, but I'll be painting in Photoshop. So to export this UV image layout, I want to have everything selected. That means everything has to be orange. So I'll press A and A a few times to make sure everything is selected. And then down here in my header of this UV image editor window, I'm going to click on UVs to bring up that menu, and I'll click on Export UV Layout. This is going to let me save a separate image file. In my case, I'm going to save to my Minecraft Blender folder, and it's going to save as a PNG file, but I'll name it something different than this. I'll type UV Layout Minecraft char, and I'll click on Export UV Layout. Before I do that though, I'm going to turn down the opacity of the fill of the faces. By default, it's 0.25, and what that will do is basically give you a transparent fill on each one of those squares in our layout. I don't want that, so I'll turn that down to 0, and you'll see why in a minute. Let's click on Export UV Layout. The PNG file is saved. I'll click on Control S to save, and we're going to flip over into Photoshop. Now, if you don't have Photoshop, don't worry. At the end of this little part of the video, I'm going to be talking about very briefly other options that you have on any platform that you're working with in Windows or Mac or Linux. You've got options that are all great. I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Open, and we'll go to my Minecraft folder, and I've got my UV layout PNG image right there, so I'll click Open. Now, one of the benefits of a PNG image file is it allows for transparency. That's what this checkerboard pattern means. So what you're seeing here is basically, and if you've got your resolution of this YouTube video set up to high, you can see these lines that I'm working with. If I zoom in, maybe you'll see that a little bit clearer. I've got the edges of all my faces very clear, so I know where to paint. I'm going to paint within the lines, sort of. If you did not change your fill opacity down to 0, if you left it at its default, you're going to see kind of a white or dark or light gray fill inside of all these faces, which will make things a little bit harder for you. If you're not familiar with Photoshop or graphics programs that have layers, we're going to utilize layers quite a bit here. Right now, I've got one layer, just like a layer in Blender. These layers and this layers window allow me to paint on separate sort of sheets of plastic that will all overlap in the same space. I'm going to double click on this layer name. To name it, I'm going to call it UV map, and I'm not going to do anything else on that. I'm going to make a new layer because I'm going to start painting the texture. So I'll click on this new layer button, and I'm going to drag it below, and I'm going to call this skin. So double click on that, type skin. I'm going to pick a skin color. Let's sort of go for something like that. I'll turn down my saturation maybe a little bit. Maybe I'll make it a little bit more red than that. Maybe I'll make it a little bit darker as well. I'm not going Canon here. I'm not sure that I'm going to be painting this right. So which faces need skin? I'm actually not entirely sure which end of these arms and legs. In this case, this is the arm is the top, so I'm going to go back and check that. But what I'll do first is I'll paint the skin on his face. So what I'll do is I'm going to use my marquee tool, select sort of this area. I'll hold shift to make another plus. I'm going to go outside the lines a little bit just so I make sure I'm not getting any white or black lines. And I'm going to use my fill tool. There's my paint bucket. There we go. They've changed the way it looks in this version of Photoshop, and I'll fill in that section. I'm going to flip back over into Blender because I want to make sure that the faces that I paint on the hand sections are the right ones. So I'm going to go back into this other sync mode, and I'm going to select faces. That's the legs, which don't have any skin on them, but these bottom 4 will be the faces that I'm going to need to put some skin on. Probably only the bottom part of them though. Okay, back into Photoshop, probably up to about there, and I'm going to paint in that with skin as well. Is that all the skin I'm working with right now? I think it is. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to do a time lapse for this part of the video, but I will be back with a few tips in a moment. Alright, so it's at this point that I want to make sure I save all this. In fact, I should have saved it before this. I'm going to go ahead and press Control S to save. Now, when I'm saving this file, I have layers, and layers cannot be saved inside of any JPEG or PNG file. In this case, we started with a PNG file. So Photoshop is telling us by bringing up this window that it wants to save as a Photoshop document, a PSD file. I'm going to let it because I want to go back to this later if I want to change anything, and I want to keep these layers intact. You'll notice that I made layers for the UV map. I left that on its own layer. I made a layer for the cloth, the eyes, the rest of the face, the hair, and the skin. And then I used tools like the burn tool. That's this little hand. The opposite of burn is dodge. Burn makes things darker, and it has 3 modes basically. It has highlights and midtones and shadows, and you might have seen me switch between those as I was burning, making areas dark to make it look like the cloth isn't totally uniform. Because in the next step we're going to duplicate all of these layers except for the UV map, and we're going to make it all pixely like in the game Minecraft. So what I'll do is I'll switch back over to my hand tool. I'll press the H key, and I'm going to select all of these layers, and I want to preserve them in case I want to change them later. So I'll select all of them, and then I'll go up to the layers menu, and I'll click on duplicate layers, and I'll press OK. That made a copy of all the other layers, and that's just fine. And if I want to be even more meticulous than I am being right now, I might actually make some layer folders, and then I might move some of these into these layer folders called groups. I might name this new, and I can collapse that. I'll make a new folder. I'll put this below, and I'll call this original. So the entire point of making a Photoshop document with layers is so that you can preserve the original and you can go back to it later. So we don't want to ever corrupt this original drawing. It's pretty quick and not very good, to be honest, but if I want to change anything, I can go back later. It's with these new layers that what I'll do is I'll flatten them. I'll merge these layers together. So I'll select them by clicking and then holding Shift and clicking down. I'll right click and I'll say merge layers, and that should merge them all into one. I'm doing that because I want to apply the Mosaic filter to this to make it all pixely. So I'll go up to filter and pixelate and Mosaic, and you'll see a preview in this window. Of course, you can drag around to see it. So I can get a different size of pixels in here by dragging this cell size up, and that's becoming more pixelated. Now I took a look at the original Minecraft Steve. I Google image searched him, and he has 8 pixels running across his face. So in case you're wondering what size to go with, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and a bit. So I might go a little bit bigger, maybe 20 in my case is about the right size. And that's looking about as close as I'm going to get. Of course, you can change that if you don't like it. You can make it more blurry or less blurry depending on what you want. And as you can see, because I did some blurring and splotches, I'm getting this nice variation across my texture. So that's what it's going to look like. Maybe I did too much or too little, and that's why I left my original layers alone in their own copies. So if I don't like the way that this turned out, I can always delete this new folder and go back to the original and make changes later. I think that looks pretty good for me, so I'll click OK. I'll save it, Control S. Now Photoshop does save in this PSD file, and Blender actually, as of very recently, I think as of Blender 2.72, it does accept Photoshop files, but I'm not going to trust that yet. So what I'll do is I'll export this back out to a PNG file. Now when I export it out, I don't want to have these black lines on it, so I'll unshow or hide the that UV map layer so we don't see the black lines anymore. And I'll go up to File, and I'm going to save for web and devices. So save for web, used to be called save for web and devices, and I want to save as another PNG. PNG files are great. We'll select PNG 24 because they are uncompressed. They are lossless. Unlike JPEGs, which get like artifacts in them and noise, PNGs are lossless and they're compressed. They are a bigger file size, but I prefer them. They also allow for this transparency. So I'll click on Save. We're going to output to the same folder again. So I will click on Minecraft Blender, and I will change this to uv-map-01.png, and I'll click on Save. Now, of course, not everybody has Photoshop, but no matter what system you're on, either Windows or Mac or even Linux, you have free or cheap alternatives to Photoshop that are very easy to use as well. What's on the screen right now is Paint.net, and Paint.net is Windows only, but just like Photoshop, it allows you to apply filters like blur or pixelate, and it has, most importantly, a layers ability as well. Paint.net allows you to save to its own native file format, not PSD, although there is a plugin available for Photoshop files. It works pretty well if you need to open up an already created Photoshop file. I've already made a new merge layer of all the different cloth, skin, eyes, face, and hair layers, and if you want to pixelate, you'll need to go up to the Effects menu and Distort and Pixelate, and that way you can take what you've drawn and you can turn up the pixelation to whichever value you like. The next option is Gimp, and Gimp is a totally free piece of software. Again, I'll put a link in the description below that you can open up Photoshop files natively or save to its own native file format. Right now I've got a whole layer group of my layers, and I can apply a filter all at the same time. If I go up to Filters and Blur and Pixelate, I can take that whole group of layers and I can apply a pixelation to it all at once. I can just turn that up to whatever level I desire, and I can press OK, and I get pixelation as well, although I just got an error for some reason. I'm going to move on. The next option, if you're on a Mac, is Pixelmator. Pixelmator is the one not free version out of this list of 4. It's about $20, and you can get it from the Mac App Store. It's absolutely great, especially for $20. It's a killer deal. Just like all the other programs I'll mention, it has a layers ability and filter abilities. I'll turn off my UV map layer here. You can open up and I believe even save to .psd Photoshop files, which is great. And of course it has its own file format. If I want to pixelate my selected layer of merged elements, I can go over to my effects browser. I can change all effects to stylize, and I can choose pixelate right here, double click, and now I can turn up my scale to whatever scale that I want and press OK. The very last option, last but not least, is a web-based option. This is Pixlr, Pixlr.com, and it is a web-based, flash-based photo editor, and it is amazing. If you can't install a new program on your computer because maybe you're at work or school, this is a great workaround for you. It's a lot like Photoshop. Of course, it is web-based, so you have to go to File, Open, and then File, Save As if you want to save away from it, and it does support PSD files. I'm going to select my merge layer, and I believe if I go up to Filter and Pixelate, I can turn up the pixelation on this layer, which I need to show, and as you can see, I've pixelated the texture. So if you don't have Photoshop, don't worry about it. There are free available alternatives, and you can check the description below for links. So back in Blender, we have our Blender file just as we left it. We unwrapped all of the faces. We're still in edit mode. We still have the UV image editor window up. And at this point where I want to open up my exported painted UV map into Blender. So with this window up, still in edit mode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open, so I'll click on the open button, I'll open that texture, and I believe if I go to this little thumbnail view that it's the PNG file. It will accept the PSD I think, but I'll use my PNG, and I'll click Open Image. So now we can see that everything kind of doesn't overlap properly, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. It looks like everything got shifted over a little bit, at least in terms of these top faces, and that confuses me a little bit. Maybe you caught my mistake. Yeah, I'm not sure why. So I'm going to try to see if I can move things around a little bit. Normally that isn't a good practice, but I'm not sure why that happened. Let's box select some of these things and move them around. So it might do a good job there. Let's box select these ones and we'll center them on. And that's actually never happened to me before, at least not without my knowing. Maybe I accidentally moved things around after I exported. I don't remember. Maybe I moved the faces around when I was in Photoshop. It's very odd. Okay, so things are in the right spot now, and now we need to make a material. So I'm going to go back, actually, I'm going to forget about this window for a moment. I'll make it smaller. I'll go back into object mode by pressing tab in this window. I want to go into material view. This will let me see the material that's on my model. So I'll click on material, that's the viewport shading. And right now I just have this simple blue material on the object. I'll go over to my properties window to the materials tab. I've got this one material. If you don't have material, that's okay. In fact, I'll get rid of this. I'll click the little minus button. So now we have no material. We're starting from scratch. I'll click on the new button to make this new material. I'm going to name it. So Minecraft Steve. And at this point where I'm going to use some nodes and add an image texture. So again, we need to bring up a node window. So I'm going to change this UV image editor window. In fact, I'll leave it there and I'll make a copy of this window and I'll open up a node editor window right here. So if you recall, we have these nodes and every material has a material output. It also has a diffuse, that means a normal color. We need to input an image texture into this color little input there. That's a yellow dot, which means a colored image. So I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a image texture from the texture option. There it is. I'll connect the color and the color, and it's giving me a black because it has no image open. I can just click on this little icon and select UV map 01. That's the picture that I opened. And there we go. And again, I can see this on here because I am in material viewport shading mode. So we've got our texture on our character. The last thing I'm going to suggest that you do is I suggest that you pack this image file into your Blender file. Right now my image file is a separate file. I can open it again if I want to. I can select it from my folder on my computer. But if I ever move this Blender file, or if I ever remove the image texture, they will get separated and Blender will not be able to find the image file. So to pack this image file into the Blender file, I'm going to go up to the File menu and click on External Data and click on Pack All into Blend. And that will take the image file and actually take the ones and zeros from the image file and put it into the .blend file. As you can see up here, it just gave me a notice that said packed one file. That'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.